The year is approximately 170 of the Common Era, and on this particular night, the most powerful man in the world sits alone in a leather tent at the edge of civilization, dipping a stylus into wax and writing to himself. The Danube River lies frozen a short walk from where he sits, and beyond it stretch the vast and dark forests of the peoples the Romans call the Germanic tribes, and beyond that, lands no Roman has ever mapped. He is far from Rome, far from the marble palaces and the Senate and the public baths, far from everything that the world imagines when it hears the word emperor. And yet here, in the quiet of a military camp on the frozen frontier, Marcus Aurelius is about to write something that will outlast every empire, every monument, every law he ever signed. The tent is not large, though it is larger than any other in the camp. For Marcus Aurelius does not ask his soldiers to endure conditions he is not willing to share, and so his quarters are only modestly more comfortable than those of his legates. The floor is packed earth covered with straw, and a heavy woolen blanket has been laid down beneath the folding desk where he works, and beside the desk stands the brazier, its bronze body filled with charcoal that glows a deep and steady amber, casting warmth outward in slow waves that reach his hands, his face, the edges of the wax tablets spread before him. The tent walls are thick canvas, treated with oil to keep out the rain and the wind, and they ripple faintly in the night air, each ripple causing the lamplight to shift and dance across the interior in patterns that are almost hypnotic in their slow, rhythmic movement. There are 3 oil lamps burning on the desk, each one at a different height, and their combined light creates a small island of warmth and clarity in what is otherwise a very dark and very cold night. Outside, the temperature has fallen well below freezing, and the wind blows steadily from the north, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of snow and pine resin and the particular mineral coldness of a river that has turned to ice. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of burning charcoal and heated olive oil and the faint, musty scent of wax tablets and old leather, and beneath all of that, the lingering trace of wood smoke that clings to every piece of cloth and every surface in a frontier camp. Marcus sits on a folding camp stool, the kind that every officer in the Roman army carries, its wooden frame creaking slightly when he shifts his weight, and across his shoulders he wears a woolen military cloak, deep in color and heavy enough to keep out the cold that seeps through the canvas walls, no matter how carefully the tent has been sealed. He is in his 50s now, though in this light, in the warm amber glow of the lamps and the brazier, the years show themselves more in the slowness of his movements than in any visible mark upon him. His hands, resting on the desk, are the hands of a man who has spent decades both reading and writing, and there is ink stained into the skin around his fingernails that no amount of washing has ever fully removed, and there is a slight stiffness in the way he flexes his fingers before picking up the stylus, the kind of stiffness that comes from cold and from age, and from the cumulative weight of years spent holding the reins of an empire. He picks up the stylus. It is a simple thing, made of bronze, its point worn smooth from use, and he turns it slowly between his fingers for a moment, the way a man might turn a ring or a coin when his thoughts are elsewhere. The wax tablet before him is blank, its surface a smooth, pale rectangle waiting for whatever he chooses to press into it. And for a long moment he simply looks at it. the lamplight reflecting off the polished surface, his breath slow and steady in the cold air. Then he begins to write, and the scratch of the stylus against the wax is the only sound in the tent, a quiet, private sound. The sound of a man talking to himself in the only way that feels honest. The camp outside has settled into the deep stillness of a winter night on the frontier. 10,000 soldiers sleep in rows of leather tents that stretch out in every direction from the command tent, and their breathing and their dreams, and the occasional murmur of a man talking in his sleep, are the only human sounds that break the silence. Horses stamp in their picket lines, their breath rising in white clouds that catch the faint moonlight, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the palisade, a wolf calls out once and then is silent, as if it has said all that needed to be said. The Danube, half a mile to the east, groans occasionally as the ice shifts under the pressure of the current beneath, a deep, slow sound that travels across the frozen ground and seems to come from the earth itself, as if the world were breathing in its sleep. And in the command tent, the emperor writes. He writes to no one and to everyone. He writes because the night is long and the mind will not quiet itself, and because the act of pressing thoughts into wax has become, over the years, the only reliable way he has found to examine what he truly believes, as opposed to what he merely says he believes when he sits in the Senate or receives a delegation or signs a law. The meditations, as they would later be called, were never meant for anyone else's eyes, and that is perhaps the most remarkable thing about them, that the most widely read work of philosophy in the Western tradition began as the private notebook of a tired man who could not sleep. The lamp nearest to him flickers once, twice, and then steadies, and the light it casts across the tablet shifts from warm amber to something slightly deeper, more golden, as if the flame itself has settled into a more contemplative mood. Marcus pauses in his writing and looks up, his eyes moving to the tent's entrance, where the canvas has been tied back to allow a thin sliver of cold air to enter and circulate, and through that gap he can see a few stars, bright and sharp against the deep blue, black of the frontier sky, stars that look the same here as they do in Rome, as they do everywhere, as they have looked since long before there was a Rome to look at them from. And it is this thought, the thought that the stars are indifferent to the affairs of empires, that he presses into the wax next, his stylus moving slowly and deliberately, shaping words that are meant only for himself, but that will, in time, be read by millions of people across centuries that he cannot imagine. The charcoal in the brazier shifts and settles, sending up a small shower of sparks that rise and vanish into the darkness above, each spark a brief and brilliant point of amber light that exists for only a second before it is gone, and Marcus watches them rise with the particular kind of attention that a tired person brings to small, beautiful things in the late hours of the night, when the mind is too weary for large thoughts and finds its comfort instead in the immediate and the tangible, the glow of coals, the texture of canvas, the smell of warm olive oil, the scratch of bronze on wax. These small sensations, taken together, create a kind of tent within the tent, a private space of warmth and quiet that is separate from the empire and the wars and the weight of command, a space where a man can simply sit and breathe and write and be, for a few hours at least, no one in particular, just a person in a room with a fire and a thought to work out. There is a quality to cold that people who have never spent a winter on the frontier do not understand, for they think of cold as a temperature, a number on a scale, and they do not know that cold, in its more extreme forms, is a presence, a thing with weight and texture, and a kind of slow, patient aggression that seeps through every layer of clothing and every inch of insulation, and presses against the skin with a persistence that no amount of wool or leather can entirely defeat. The soldiers in the camp understand this, for they have been living with it for months now, and they have developed the particular rituals of the frontier winter: the careful layering of clothing, the sharing of body heat, the habit of keeping one's feet off the ground when sitting, and the knowledge that the cold, however unpleasant, is simply a feature of the landscape, no different in its essential nature from the rain or the wind or the hardness of the ground, and that to complain about it is as futile as complaining about the presence of the sky. As you settle deeper into wherever you are resting tonight, let the warmth of this tent become your warmth as well, the steady amber glow of the brazier, the thick wool of the cloak, the sense of being enclosed in a space that is safe and still and removed from the demands of the world outside. The night is deep now, and the camp is quiet, and there is nothing that needs to be done until morning, nothing that requires your attention or your effort or your worry. Just the simple, ancient act of being present in a warm room while the cold world goes on outside, and this, Marcus might have written, is enough. The purple cloak hangs on a wooden peg near the entrance to the tent, and even in the dim light, its color is unmistakable, a deep, saturated hue that speaks of power in a language that every person in the Roman world understands without a single word being spoken. Tyrian purple, drawn from the glands of sea snails harvested along the coast of Phoenicia, so expensive that a single cloak's worth of dye could feed a family for a year, and reserved by law for the emperor and his immediate family alone. To wear the purple is to be set apart, not merely in rank or in authority, but in the most fundamental way a human being can be set apart from other human beings. And Marcus Aurelius had been wearing it for nearly 20 years now, and on this particular night, looking at it hanging there in the lamplight, he felt the weight of it as clearly as he had ever felt anything in his life. It is a strange thing to be the most powerful man in the world and to understand with the clarity that only late nights and early mornings can bring, that power is not what people imagine it to be. The soldiers in the camp outside his tent believe that the emperor can do anything, that his word moves armies and his signature reshapes provinces, and his favor can raise a family from obscurity to prominence in a single day. And they are not wrong about any of this. Not exactly, but they are wrong about what it feels like to be the one who wields that power. It does not feel like strength. It feels like a weight that grows heavier with every year, not because the empire itself grows heavier, but because one becomes more and more aware of everything one does not know, everything one cannot control, everything one will inevitably fail to do well enough. There were reports on his desk that he had not yet read, dispatches from Rome, carried by mounted messengers who had ridden for days through winter roads to reach him, and each one contained a problem that only he could solve, or that the system had decided only he should try to solve. a dispute between two provincial governors that had escalated beyond what any lesser magistrate could resolve, a grain shortage in North Africa that threatened the bread supply of the capital, a petition from a community of Christians in Asia Minor who were being persecuted by their neighbors and who had written to the emperor directly, as people in desperate circumstances will sometimes do, appealing to the highest authority they know in the hope that somewhere, at the top of the long chain of command, there might be a person willing to listen. And these were only the problems that had arrived today. Tomorrow there would be more, and the day after that more still, an unending river of human difficulty flowing toward him from every corner of the world, and his task was to stand in the middle of that river and not be swept away, to receive each problem, consider it, make a decision, and then receive the next one, and the next for as long as he lived. There was no vacation from this work, no sabbatical, no moment when the weight could be set down entirely, for even in his rare moments of leisure, he knew that the reports were piling up, the messengers were riding, the problems were accumulating, the purple did not come off. And yet this was the role that fate had assigned him, or that the gods had chosen for him, or that the simple mechanics of birth and adoption had placed him in, depending on which framework of meaning one preferred. And Marcus had long since made his peace with the idea that the question of whether he wanted this life was irrelevant. He had not asked to be emperor, any more than a tree asks to grow in a particular patch of soil, and yet a tree does not rail against the soil in which it finds itself. It simply grows, putting down roots where it can, reaching for light where it is available, and in its own quiet, vegetative way, fulfilling the nature that has been given to it. This was the Stoic teaching that had sustained him through the worst years, and it was the teaching he returned to now, on this cold night, with the weight of the purple hanging a few feet away, and the weight of the empire pressing down on every thought. He wrote a few lines into the wax, pressing the stylus with careful deliberation, shaping each letter as if the act of writing were itself a form of discipline, a way of making his thoughts behave with the same precision and order that he tried to bring to the governance of Rome. The words were private, meant for no one's eyes but his own, and they said something very close to this, that a person who is not useful to the whole, who does not contribute to the common good, is like a limb cut off from the body, and that the purpose of life is not to seek pleasure or avoid pain, but to fulfill one's function within the larger whole, whatever that function might be. And his function, he wrote, was to govern well, or at least to try to govern well, and to accept that trying was the most that any human being could ever do. And there was another thought that came to him in the quiet of the tent, a thought about the nature of the body that bears the purple, for the body is itself a kind of empire, a complex system of organs and functions and processes that must be maintained and regulated and kept in balance. And just as the emperor must attend to the needs of the provinces and the legions and the courts, so too must he attend to the needs of his own flesh, and the neglect of either, the neglect of the empire or the neglect of the body, leads inevitably to disorder and decline. Marcus understood this connection between the personal and the political more clearly than most, for he lived it every day, feeling in his own aching joints and his chronic cough the toll that the empire was taking on its servant, and understanding that the two could not be separated, that the health of the ruler and the health of the ruled were, in some deep and practical sense, the same thing. The loneliness of the position was something that no one had prepared him for, not his teachers, not his adoptive father, not the years of training and observation that had preceded his accession to the throne. To be emperor was to be surrounded by people, and yet to be profoundly alone, for every conversation was colored by the awareness that the person speaking to him wanted something, a favor, a promotion, a pardon, a grant of land, and the genuineness of any interaction was always, to some degree, in doubt. He could not be sure, even with his closest advisors, whether their counsel was offered out of genuine concern for the empire or out of a desire to advance their own interests. And this uncertainty, this inability to trust fully in the sincerity of those around him, was perhaps the heaviest part of the burden, heavier than the wars and heavier than the petitions and heavier than the endless administrative work, because it meant that he could never fully let down his guard, never fully relax into the simple pleasure of human company, never be merely Marcus rather than the emperor. The brazier had burned lower, and the warmth in the tent had receded slightly, and Marcus rose from his stool and crossed to it. Taking a handful of charcoal from the supply kept in a bronze bucket beside it, and placing the pieces carefully onto the embers, one by one, watching as each new piece began to glow, first at the edges and then throughout, the amber light brightening and steadying as the fresh fuel caught and held. It was a small act, replenishing a fire, but it was also, in its way, a meditation on the nature of sustained effort, on the idea that warmth is not created once and then forgotten, but must be maintained, tended, fed, hour after hour and day after day, and that this is not a burden, but simply what fire requires, and what a life of duty requires as well, and what the empire itself requires if it is not to fall back into coldness and darkness. He had not always been an emperor, and it was important to remember this, not because the memory of his early life was especially dramatic or unusual, but because the education he had received as a boy had shaped the man who now sat in a tent on the Danube frontier, writing philosophy to himself in the small hours of the morning. Marcus Aurelius had been born into a prominent Roman family in the year 121, his father a praetor, his mother the daughter of a consul, and from the earliest age he had been surrounded by the kinds of advantages that wealth and status could provide: the best tutors, the finest libraries, the most refined social circles in the capital. But it was not the tutors of rhetoric, or the libraries of Greek literature, or the social circles of the senatorial class that had made the deepest impression on him. It was the philosophers. The first and most important of these was a man named Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher and a senator, who had taken an interest in the young Marcus when the boy was still in his early teens, and who had, with a patience and gentleness that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life, introduced him to the works of Epictetus, the former slave who had become one of the greatest moral teachers the world had ever known. Epictetus had died before Marcus was born, but his teachings had been preserved by one of his students, a man named Arrian, who had written down the philosopher's discourses with the care and precision that one might use to transcribe the words of a prophet. And it was through these transcriptions that Marcus first encountered the ideas that would become the foundation of his entire intellectual and moral life. The teaching was simple, or at least its core was simple, and it went something like this: that there are things in this world that are within our power, and things that are not, and that the path to peace lies in distinguishing clearly between the two, and then directing all of our effort toward the former while accepting the latter with grace. Our opinions, our desires, our aversions, our choices, our efforts, these are ours. Our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, the opinions that others hold of us, the events that befall us through no fault or merit of our own, these are not ours, not in the way that matters, not in the way that allows us to control them, or even reliably influence them. And so the wise person, according to Epictetus, does not waste energy trying to control what cannot be controlled, but instead focuses entirely on cultivating the one thing that is truly and completely within their power, which is the quality of their own mind and the character of their own responses. For a boy of 14, raised in the lap of imperial luxury, this teaching was both radical and deeply appealing, for Marcus had already begun to sense, with the instinctive understanding that some children possess, that the world of privilege in which he lived was not the whole of reality, and that the people around him, the senators and the courtiers and the ambitious young men who orbited his family like moths around a flame, were not entirely happy, not even the ones who had achieved everything they had set out to achieve. There was an agitation in the court, a restless striving, a constant awareness of position and status and favor, and Marcus, even as a boy, found it exhausting to watch, and he recognized in the Stoic teaching an alternative, a way of living that did not depend on the constant accumulation of external goods or the perpetual cultivation of reputation. There were other teachers too. A grammarian named Alexander of Kochiaeum, who had taught him Greek literature with such passion that Marcus would remain a lover of Homer and Euripides for his entire life, reading their verses on campaign when the nights were long and the mind needed feeding with something other than military reports. A tutor named Trosius Aper, who had introduced him to the study of history, showing him how the rise and fall of civilizations followed patterns that were, if not predictable, then at least recognizable, and that the Rome of his own day was not exempt from these patterns, no matter how powerful or permanent it might seem. A rhetorician named Fronto, with whom he exchanged letters for many years, and whose affectionate, occasionally fussy correspondence reveals a relationship that was equal parts intellectual and paternal, full of literary criticism and dietary advice and expressions of mutual regard that would not be out of place in a letter between a father and a son. And it was in the quiet of those early study sessions, seated on a cushion in the sunlit library of the palace, the scent of cedar scrolls and beeswax tablets filling the warm air, that Marcus first felt the particular pleasure of a mind turned toward something true. The wax tablet rested cool and smooth against his knee, the stylus making its faint scratching sound as he copied out passages from Epictetus, and even then, as a boy, he understood that this simple act of attention, this deliberate focusing of the mind upon what is good and rational and worthy, was itself a kind of freedom, a freedom that no emperor could grant and no conqueror could take away. It was a freedom available to anyone willing to sit still long enough to practice it, and the boy who would become emperor carried, this understanding with him across the years, across the miles of frozen frontier, into the darkness of the nights when sleep would not come, and the only remedy was to pick up the stylus once more and begin again. And then there were the teachers who were not formally teachers at all, but who taught by example, the men and women of integrity whom the young Marcus observed in the daily life of the imperial household. His mother Domitia Lucilla, who was known for her generosity and her simplicity of life despite her enormous wealth, who gave freely to the poor, and who managed her vast estates with a competence and fairness that Marcus would later cite as a model of practical virtue. His adoptive father, the Emperor Antoninus Pius, whose reign was so steady and so calm that historians would later struggle to find anything dramatic to say about it, which was, in its own way, the highest compliment a Roman emperor could receive, for the absence of drama meant the presence of good governance, and the absence of crisis meant the presence of wisdom, and the absence of memorable events meant that the empire was being run so well that nothing went wrong. And so the boy grew into a man, and the man grew into a philosopher, not the kind of philosopher who stands in a public square and argues about the nature of the good, though Marcus had read those philosophers and respected them, but the quieter kind, the kind who carries his philosophy inside him like a lantern, using it not to impress others, but to illuminate his own path through the darkness of a life that was, by any measure, extraordinarily difficult. He learned to examine his own motives with the same rigor that a physician brings to the examination of a body, asking not merely what he was doing, but why he was doing it, whether the action sprang from a genuine desire to do good, or from a smaller, more selfish impulse, the desire for praise, the fear of criticism, the wish to appear virtuous rather than to be virtuous. This habit of self-examination, learned from Epictetus and refined through years of practice, would become the engine that drove the meditations, and it would sustain him through decades of war, plague, grief, and the slow, relentless pressure of imperial duty that never, not for a single day, allowed him to forget what he was supposed to be. And there was something else that his education had given him, something less tangible than knowledge, but perhaps more important, which was the understanding that learning is not a phase of life, but a condition of it, that the mind, like the body, requires daily exercise if it is to remain strong and supple and capable of meeting the challenges that the world presents. The boy who had sat at the feet of Rusticus and read the discourses of Epictetus had become a man who understood that wisdom is not a destination, but a direction. Not a thing you possess, but a way you move through the world, and that the moment you stop moving in that direction, the moment you begin to believe that you have arrived, that you have learned enough, that you have achieved the understanding you sought, that is the moment when the decay begins, when the mind starts to stiffen and the soul begins to close in upon itself, and the philosophy that was once a living flame becomes a set of rehearsed phrases and comfortable certainties that have lost their power to illuminate anything. Marcus understood this, and it was this understanding, perhaps more than any single teaching or any individual teacher, that kept him writing night after night, year after year, long after a lesser person would have concluded that the work was done. The first book of what we now call the Meditations was not written on the Danube frontier, but in a place called Carnuntum, a Roman military garrison town on the banks of the Danube, during one of the campaigns against the tribes to the north, and it begins with a remarkable act of gratitude, a long, careful catalogue of the people who had shaped him and the specific gifts each one had given. This is not the opening that most readers expect from a work of philosophy, for we are accustomed to philosophy beginning with principles, with axioms, with bold declarations about the nature of reality, or the good or the beautiful. But Marcus begins instead with thankfulness, with a quiet, methodical acknowledgement of every person who had contributed to his character, as if he were drawing a map of his own soul and labeling each region with the name of the person who had helped to form it. From his grandfather Verus he had learned, he wrote, good character and a measure of self-control. From his mother, piety and generosity, and the habit of abstaining not only from doing harm, but even from thinking harmful thoughts. From his tutor, the importance of not taking sides in political factions, and of enduring the faults of others with patience. From his brother Severus, the love of family and the practice of truthfulness, and the habit of meeting those who had done him wrong with forgiveness rather than resentment. From his adoptive father Antoninus Pius, gentleness and an unwavering commitment to the tasks at hand, and the ability to listen carefully to those who offered advice, even when that advice was unsolicited or poorly expressed. And from his Stoic teachers, above all Rusticus, the understanding that a life spent in the pursuit of moral improvement was the only life worth living, and that the pursuit itself, the daily, hourly practice of examining one's own thoughts and correcting one's own course, was not a burden but a privilege. What is striking about this opening is not merely its tone of gratitude, which is genuine and touching, but its underlying philosophical purpose. For the act of cataloguing these debts is also an act of self-definition, a way of saying this is who I am. This is what I am made of. These are the influences that have shaped me. And if I am to live well, it will be because I have honored what they gave me rather than squandered it. The meditations are, at their deepest level, an extended exercise in this kind of honest self-assessment, a practice that the Stoics called prosochi, meaning attention or watchfulness, the discipline of monitoring one's own mind with the same care that a sailor monitors the horizon, watching for the first signs of a storm, the first drift off course, the first indication that the winds have shifted and a correction is needed. In practice, this meant that Marcus would sit down at his desk, as he was sitting now, in the lamplight, with a blank wax tablet before him, and he would begin by asking himself questions that most people never think to ask, or that they ask only in moments of crisis, and then quickly set aside. What am I feeling right now, and why? Is this impulse that I have toward anger or frustration or anxiety rooted in something real, or is it rooted in a false judgment, a mistaken belief about what is truly important? Am I acting out of a desire to do good, or out of a desire to appear good? Am I treating the people around me with the respect and patience that their shared humanity demands? Or am I allowing my irritation at their faults to overshadow my recognition of our common nature? These were not easy questions, and they did not become easier with practice, for the mind is an extraordinarily subtle and resourceful instrument, capable of deceiving itself in ways that are almost impossible to detect from within, and Marcus was honest enough to acknowledge this, writing at one point that the soul is dyed with the color of its thoughts, a metaphor that captures both the beauty and the danger of inner life. For just as a piece of cloth can be stained with a dye that transforms its appearance, so too can a human mind be stained by the quality of its habitual thoughts. And if those thoughts are angry, or fearful, or greedy, or resentful, then the soul itself takes on those colors, gradually and imperceptibly, until the person no longer recognizes themselves. But the reverse is also true, and this is the hope that runs through the meditations like a thread of warm amber light through a dark room, that the soul can be redyed, that by deliberately choosing what to think about and how to think about it, a person can gradually transform the quality of their inner life, can replace the dark colors with brighter ones, can cultivate a mind that is calm and rational and compassionate, not because the world has become easier or kinder, but because the person has learned to meet it with a different kind of attention. He pressed the stylus deeper into the wax, feeling the slight resistance of it, the faint grain of the beeswax giving way beneath the bronze point. And the lamplight wavered for a moment as a gust of wind found its way through the canvas, sending a thread of cold air across his hands. Outside, the camp was settling into its deepest silence, the last patrol having passed, the last whispered conversation having died away. And in that silence the act of writing became something almost meditative, the scratch of the stylus like the slow, deliberate breathing of a man teaching himself to let go of the day. Each sentence was a small act of ordering, of taking the raw and formless material of thought and giving it shape. And in this shaping there was a kind of rest, a rest that was not sleep, but was perhaps its cousin, a stillness of the mind that prepared the body for the deeper stillness that was to come. The writing of the meditations was not a literary project in the way that we might understand such a thing, for Marcus had no intention of publishing what he wrote, no ambition to be read by future generations, no desire to be counted among the great philosophers of the tradition. He was writing to himself, for himself, in the same way that a person might keep a private diary or jot down notes after a difficult conversation, and the lack of any external audience gave the writing a freedom and an honesty that published philosophy rarely achieves. For Marcus had no reason to impress, no reputation to protect, no readers whose expectations he needed to manage. He could write about his failures as plainly as his successes, could admit to the moments when his temper had gotten the better of him, could acknowledge the gaps between the person he wanted to be and the person he actually was, and this candor, this willingness to be seen, even by himself, in all his imperfection, is what gives the meditations their extraordinary power. For they are not the polished work of a man who has achieved wisdom, but the working notes of a man who is still in the process of seeking it. He thought sometimes about the physical act of writing itself, about the way the stylus pressed into the wax and left behind a mark that could be smoothed away if the thought was wrong, if the sentence needed correction, if the whole passage needed to be reconsidered and rewritten. There was a metaphor in this that appealed to him, the idea that the mind, like the wax, could be inscribed and reinscribed, that mistakes were not permanent, that the surface could be made smooth again, and the thought could be attempted once more. And this understanding, that failure was not final, and that error was not irrevocable, was one of the most sustaining aspects of the practice. for it meant that every night's writing was not a performance to be judged, but an experiment to be learned from, and that the only real failure was the failure to sit down and begin. And so the writing continued, night after night, on campaign and in garrison, in Rome and on the frontier, in moments of relative calm and in moments of intense difficulty. And each entry was an exercise, a discipline, a way of keeping the mind aligned with its own best intentions. And each entry was also, though Marcus would never have put it this way, a small act of courage, for it takes courage to look honestly at one's own failings, to write them down in plain language, to refuse the comfort of self-deception, and to begin again and again and again with the patient, unglamorous determination of a man who understands that the work of becoming good is never finished, not in this life, not for anyone, and that the effort itself, sustained through every kind of weather, is the only reward that philosophy can genuinely promise. There is a particular quality to the night sky on the frontier that a person who has spent their whole life in a city will never fully understand, for in a city, even at night, the air is thick with light, the light of lamps and torches and cooking fires, and the stars are dimmed by it, reduced to a few bright points that punctuate an otherwise orange glow, like the last survivors of something that was once vast and magnificent. But on the Danube frontier, 200 miles from the nearest city of any size, the sky at night is not orange, but deep and absolute black. And against this blackness the stars emerge in numbers, and with a clarity that can make a person feel, for a moment, as if they are standing not on the solid ground of the earth, but on the surface of a small, fragile sphere that is drifting through an infinite and indifferent emptiness. Marcus had noticed this on his first campaign, years ago, when he had stepped out of his tent in the early hours of the morning and looked up and felt, with a force that was almost physical, the sheer scale of the universe in which he lived, and the correspondingly small scale of everything he had ever worried about or worked for or fought to protect. The feeling had passed, as feelings do, but it had left a residue, a kind of philosophical afterimage, and he had returned to it many times in his writing, using the cosmic perspective as a way of shrinking his problems back down to their proper size, of reminding himself that the disputes of the Senate, the quarrels of the provinces, even the wars on the frontier, were, in the grand scheme of things, very small indeed, and that the wise person keeps this smallness constantly in view, not to diminish the importance of doing good, but to prevent the ego from inflating the self and its concerns beyond what reality can support. He thought sometimes of the astronomers, the men of learning, who had calculated the distances to the stars and the size of the sun and the shape of the earth. And he found in their work a kind of comfort that had nothing to do with the specific details of their calculations and everything to do with the general implication, which was that the universe was very old and very large, and that the affairs of human beings occupied a very small portion of it, and that this was not a cause for despair, but for a kind of liberating perspective, For if the universe was indifferent to Marcus Aurelius, then it was also indifferent to his enemies and his rivals and his critics and the people who plotted against him or misunderestimated him or wished him ill. And this meant that their opinions, however loudly they were expressed, carried no more cosmic weight than his own, which was to say, none at all. This was not nihilism, for Marcus did not conclude from the vastness of the universe that nothing mattered, but rather that the things that truly mattered were very few and very simple, and that most of what consumed the attention of the people around him, the jockeying for position, the accumulation of wealth, the cultivation of reputation, the endless, grinding pursuit of status and influence, was noise, static, a kind of collective hallucination that human beings inflicted upon themselves, because they could not bear the thought of their own insignificance, and so created elaborate fictions to convince themselves that they were, in fact, at the center of something important. He pulled the woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders and listened to the sound of the wind moving through the pine trees beyond the ramparts, a sound like the slow breathing of the earth itself, vast and unhurried, and utterly indifferent to the small affairs of men. The cold seeped through the leather of his boots and the wool of his tunic, a penetrating, bone, deep chill that no amount of brazier heat could fully dispel. And in this cold there was a kind of clarity, a sharpening of the senses that made the world feel more immediate and more real than it ever did in the heated halls of Rome. Up above, the stars burned with a ferocity that the city dweller never saw, for the fires of Rome dimmed the sky. But out here on the frontier the darkness was total, and the stars were overwhelming, and a man standing beneath them could not help but feel the truth of what the philosophers taught, that the rational order of the cosmos was immeasurably larger than any human concern, and that to align oneself with this order, to place one's thoughts and actions in harmony with the way things actually are, was the only form of greatness that the universe recognized. The ice on the Danube groaned again, that deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the center of the earth. And Marcus paused in his writing and listened to it, letting the sound fill the tent for a moment before it faded back into the general silence. And he thought about the river, which had been flowing long before there were human beings to stand on its banks and admire it or fight over it or build bridges across it, and which would be flowing long after the last human being had disappeared, and which knew nothing of the Roman Empire or the peoples beyond the frontier or the wars that were fought in its name, and which cared nothing for any of it. Because a river does not care, it simply flows, and this, Marcus wrote, is the attitude that the wise person cultivates toward the events of their own life. Not indifference, exactly, but a kind of serene acceptance, an understanding that the things which happen are simply the things which happen, and that our only real choice is how we respond. he wrote a few more lines, pressing the stylus with slow deliberation into the wax, and then he set the tablet aside and closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, but to rest, to let the silence of the frontier night settle around him like a blanket. And in the darkness behind his eyelids, he could still see the stars, imprinted on his vision like the afterimage of a bright light. And he breathed slowly and deeply, and the cold air filled his lungs, and the warmth of the brazier pressed against his face and hands. And for a moment, just a moment, the weight of the empire was not gone, but was simply one small thing among many small things. And he was not the emperor, but merely a man sitting by a fire on the edge of the known world, looking up at the stars. And the thought that came to him then, rising unbidden from somewhere deeper than the intellect, was that the stars did not need to know about the empire in order to shine, and that the empire did not need to justify its existence to the stars, and that these two things, the vast indifferent cosmos and the small striving world of human affairs, existed side by side without contradiction, and that a person who could hold both realities in mind at the same time, who could feel the grandeur of the one without being crushed by it, and could attend to the demands of the other without being inflated by it, such a person had achieved something rare, not wisdom exactly, but the precondition for wisdom, which is the ability to see things as they actually are, in their proper proportions, neither larger nor smaller than the truth. The thought of his own insignificance did not trouble him as it might have troubled a man whose sense of self was built upon the importance of his position. For Marcus had spent years learning to separate the person from the role, to understand that the purple cloak could be removed, and the man beneath it would still be the same person, still possessed of the same mind, and the same capacity for virtue, and the same fundamental nature as every other human being who had ever lived. The empire was large, and the universe was larger, and he was very small, and this was not a humiliation but a relief, for it meant that the stakes were not as high as the court, and the Senate, and the army always pretended they were, and that the most important thing he could do on any given day was not to win a battle or settle a dispute or secure the frontier, but simply to be a decent person, to act justly, to speak truthfully, to bear the burdens that had been given to him without complaint, and to remember, as the stars reminded him every night on the frontier, that the whole of human history was, from the perspective of the cosmos, no more than a brief and flickering light, and that the only thing that gave that light any meaning at all was the quality of the character that produced it. One of the most persistent themes in the Meditations, and one to which Marcus returned again and again throughout the years he spent writing, is the theme of change, the idea that everything in the universe is in a state of constant flux, that nothing remains the same from one moment to the next, and that the suffering we experience when things change is not caused by the change itself, but by our resistance to it, our stubborn often unconscious insistence that things should remain as they are, or that they should be different from what they are, or that we should be able to hold on to the things we love and keep them safe from the passage of time. He had learned this teaching from the Stoics, of course, and from the natural philosophers who had preceded them, men like Heraclitus, who had famously observed that a person cannot step into the same river twice, because the water that flows past is never the same water, and the person who steps is never entirely the same person, changed as they are by every experience, every thought, every breath. But Marcus had also learned it from his own life, from the direct, unmediated experience of watching the things he valued change, fade, disappear, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, and from the slow, painful education in acceptance that this watching had provided. He thought of the emperors who had come before him, men who had ruled the known world with absolute authority, and who were now nothing more than names on stone monuments, their power dissolved as completely as morning mist, their achievements remembered only in the fragmentary records that historians had preserved, and that time was even now in the process of erasing. He thought of the great cities of the ancient world, Troy and Babylon and Memphis, cities that had once seemed as permanent and as solid as the earth itself, and that were now ruins, their walls crumbled, their streets buried under sand and vegetation, their populations scattered to the winds of history. And he understood that Rome itself, mighty and eternal, as it seemed to those who lived within its walls, would one day be exactly what Troy and Babylon and Memphis had become, a memory, an excavation, a subject for the curiosity of scholars who lived in civilizations that did not yet exist. And this understanding, far from being depressing, was, for Marcus, a source of a strange and quiet comfort. For if everything changes, if nothing lasts, if even the greatest empires and the most powerful men are eventually reduced to dust and forgetfulness, then the particular troubles that weighed upon him on this particular night, the military campaigns and the grain shortages and the petitions and the endless, grinding machinery of governance, were themselves temporary and would pass as all things pass, and this did not mean that they were unimportant or that he should not attend to them with the full measure of his ability, but it did mean that he could hold them lightly, could carry them without being crushed by them, could do his work and then set it down, as a traveler sets down a heavy pack at the end of a long day's walk, knowing that tomorrow there will be more walking, but that tonight, for now, the weight can be released. The brazier in the corner of the tent had burned down to a bed of grey ash, and a few stubborn embers that pulsed faintly with a deep red glow, and the smell of charcoal hung in the still air, mingling with the sharper scent of the pine resin that had been daubed on the tent seams to keep out the rain. Marcus watched the embers for a long moment, mesmerized by their slow, random extinction, each one dying at its own pace. some flaring briefly before surrendering, others fading so gradually that it was impossible to say exactly when the light had gone out. There was a lesson in this, he thought, in the way that fire does not resist its own ending, but simply completes itself, and the Stoics taught that a wise person should approach their own mortality in the same spirit, not rushing toward death, but not fleeing from it either, simply allowing it to arrive when it arrives, as naturally and as without resistance, as a coal surrendering its warmth to the darkness of the night. He pressed the stylus into the wax and wrote something close to this, that the universe is change, and that life is what our thoughts make it, and that a person who understands the nature of change does not grieve when things depart, but is grateful that they were ever here at all. The people we have loved, the moments we have treasured, the experiences that have shaped us, none of these can be held, none can be kept, and the attempt to hold them is the source of most of our suffering. For we are trying to do something that the nature of reality does not permit, and nature, in the Stoic view, is not something to be fought, but to be understood and accepted, for nature is not cruel, it is simply indifferent, and indifference is not the same as malice. He thought about the seasons, which were perhaps the most visible and the most accessible example of the principle he was trying to articulate. For the seasons change with a regularity that is both comforting and, in its way, relentless, and every year the world passes through the same cycle of growth and abundance and decline and dormancy. And every year the people who inhabit the world complain about the transition, wishing that summer would last forever, or that winter would not come. And yet the seasons continue their turning regardless of human preference. And the wise person, Marcus wrote, does not wish for an endless summer, but learns to appreciate the particular beauty of each season as it arrives, finding in the bare branches of winter a starkness that is its own kind of loveliness, and in the first green shoots of spring a hopefulness that would mean nothing without the cold that preceded it. And he thought, too, about the way that change operates not only on the grand scale of empires and seasons, but on the intimate scale of the body itself. For his own body was changing, had been changing for years, and the changes were not the kind that a person welcomes or even accepts easily. For the stiffening joints and the chronic cough and the creeping fatigue were signs not of growth but of decline. And to face one's own decline with equanimity requires a kind of courage that facing the decline of distant civilizations does not. Because the distant civilization is abstract, a concept, a story told by historians, while one's own body is immediate and particular and inescapable, and the knowledge that it will not last, that it is already beginning to fail, presses against the mind with a weight that no amount of philosophical training can entirely lighten. And yet Marcus continued to write about acceptance, continued to argue for it, continued to practice it, not because the practice was easy, but because the alternative of railing against the inevitable, of spending one's remaining years in bitterness and regret, was, in his view, a far greater form of suffering than any illness could inflict. The brazier needed tending again, and Marcus rose and added more charcoal, watching as the new pieces caught and began to glow. And he thought about fire, which was one of the Stoics' favorite metaphors for the nature of the soul. For fire is never still, it is always changing, always consuming and transforming, always becoming something different from what it was a moment ago. And yet it remains recognizably itself. A flame is a flame even as it dances and shifts and changes color. And the soul, Marcus wrote, is like this, always in motion, always being reshaped by experience and thought and circumstance, and yet retaining, if we tend it carefully, an essential character that persists through all the change, a steady warmth at the center that is not altered by the fluctuations at the edges, a core of identity that is not the same as the personality or the reputation or the circumstances in which a person finds themselves, but something deeper, something that belongs to the person alone and that can be cultivated and strengthened through the practice of philosophy and the discipline of daily attention to the quality of one's own thoughts. It is easy to be virtuous in comfortable circumstances, when the weather is fair and the body is healthy and the people around us are agreeable and the future looks bright for virtue. When it costs nothing, is not really being tested at all, and the person who is kind and patient and generous when everything is going well may discover, when the circumstances change, that their virtue was not a settled quality of character, but merely a response to favorable conditions. Like a flower that blooms only in sunlight and wilts the moment the clouds gather. The real test of a person's character comes when the conditions are adverse, when the body is sick or the mind is troubled, or the people around us are difficult or the future is uncertain. And it is in these moments, and only in these moments, that we discover what we are truly made of. Marcus Aurelius understood this with a clarity that few people ever achieve, for he had been tested in ways that most of us, mercifully, will never experience. Tested by war, by plague, by the deaths of people he loved, by the relentless pressure of imperial duty, by the knowledge that millions of people depended on decisions that he alone could make, and by the slow, grinding awareness that his own body was failing him, that the aches and the cough and the chronic exhaustion that plagued him on this northern campaign were not temporary inconveniences, but the early symptoms of a decline that would, in the end, prove terminal. And yet through all of this, he continued to write and to govern and to try, with whatever energy he could muster, to be the kind of person that his philosophy told him a person should be. The wars on the Danube frontier had been going on and off, for years now, and they showed no sign of reaching a permanent conclusion. For the peoples beyond the river, the Marcomanni and the Quadi and the others, were not a single enemy that could be defeated in a single campaign, but a shifting constellation of tribes and alliances that rose and fell and reformed with a fluidity that frustrated every Roman attempt to impose a lasting settlement. There had been victories, and there had been setbacks, and there had been moments of genuine danger, most notably in the early years of the wars, when the tribes had broken through the frontier defenses and pushed deep into Roman territory, reaching as far as northern Italy itself, which had not been invaded by a foreign enemy in centuries, and whose proximity to Rome had caused a panic that was still remembered. Years later, in the capital, Marcus had not shrunk from the military demands of the crisis, though he was by nature and by preference a man of peace, a philosopher who would have been happier in a library than on a battlefield, and the soldiers who served under him respected him for this, for they could see that he did not seek glory or conquest or the thrill of command, but was simply doing what the situation required, fulfilling his function as the emperor, protecting the people who depended on him, enduring the cold and the hardship and the tedium of campaign life, because there was no one else to do it, and because his philosophy left him no alternative. He shared their rations and their sleeping conditions and their exposure to the elements. And while he could not, of course, share every hardship of the common soldier, the fact that he tried, that he insisted on living as simply as the circumstances allowed, earned him a loyalty that no amount of imperial ceremony could have commanded. And then there was the plague, the great illness that had swept through the Roman world during the early years of Marcus's reign, and which had killed, by some estimates, a remarkable proportion of the empire's population, a number so vast that it becomes almost abstract, almost impossible to grasp as a reality rather than a statistic, but which was, for Marcus, not a statistic at all, but a succession of individual losses. Friends and colleagues and servants and soldiers, each one a person whose absence left a gap in the fabric of daily life that could not be filled by any philosophy or any amount of rational reflection. He had written about death, of course, as every Stoic does, had rehearsed the arguments and the perspectives and the techniques for accepting mortality as a natural and inevitable part of life. And these writings were genuine and heartfelt and deeply wise, but they were also, in the end, only words, and words, however wise, cannot entirely shield a person from the pain of losing someone they love. What the philosophy could do, and what Marcus found that it did do, was not to eliminate the pain, but to prevent it from becoming disfiguring, from twisting his character into something bitter or cruel or despairing. And this, he came to believe, was the true purpose of Stoic practice. Not to make a person invulnerable, which is impossible, but to make them resilient, capable of absorbing the blows of fortune without being destroyed by them, like the oak tree that bends in the wind but does not break, or the stone that is worn smooth by the river but not dissolved. The storm, he wrote, does not destroy the virtuous person, but reveals them. And it is in the storm that the true character of a human being becomes visible, not in the calm, not in the comfort, not in the easy and pleasant moments of life, but in the moments when everything is at stake and the temptation to abandon one's principles is at its most powerful. He could hear the wind outside the tent, a low, persistent moaning that rose and fell like the breathing of some enormous animal, and the leather walls creaked and shuddered under its pressure, and he thought of the soldiers in their smaller tents along the ramparts, men who had no philosophy to sustain them, who endured the storm simply because endurance was what soldiers did, and he felt a wave of something that was not quite pity, and not quite admiration, but a recognition of kinship. For every human being who has ever lived has stood in a storm of one kind or another, and the question is not whether the storm will come, because it will, but whether the person standing in it will retain their capacity for kindness and reason and purpose. The brazier threw shifting shadows across the canvas walls, and in those shadows the tent seemed almost alive, a small, warm pocket of civilization huddled against the enormous indifference of the northern winter. And Marcus breathed in the scent of hot metal and wood smoke, and let his shoulders drop. And in the dropping there was a small, quiet victory, a moment in which the weight of the world was not lifted, but was simply borne with grace. And that, he wrote, is enough. The wind outside the tent had picked up, and the canvas was billowing more noticeably now, and the oil lamps flickered in response, their flames bending and dancing in the currents of cold air that found their way through every gap and seam. And Marcus watched the flames for a moment, thinking about the way they responded to the wind, bending but not going out, adjusting but not breaking. And he thought that this was perhaps the best image for the life he was trying to live, a life that was constantly being pushed and pulled and tested by forces beyond its control, but that continued to burn, continued to give light, continued to do the work that it had been given to do, not because the conditions were ideal, but because the fire itself, at its core, was steady and true, nourished not by the absence of difficulty, but by the quality of the fuel. And the fuel, in this metaphor, was the philosophy itself, the daily practice of reflection and discipline and attention that kept the inner fire burning, even when the outer world was doing everything in its power to extinguish it. He thought of the soldiers in the camp outside, men who had left their homes and their families to serve on this frozen frontier, and he felt, not for the first time, the weight of his responsibility toward them, the obligation to ensure that their sacrifices were not wasted, that the campaigns they fought served a genuine purpose, and that the peace he hoped eventually to secure would be worthy of the blood that had been shed in its pursuit. This was the burden of command, not merely the making of decisions, but the carrying of consequences. And Marcus bore it, as he bore everything else, without complaint, and without the expectation of gratitude, for to do one's duty well was, in the Stoic view, its own reward, and to seek anything beyond that, fame or honor, or the gratitude of future generations, was to mistake the nature of the good, which resides not in the opinions of others, but in the quality of the soul. It is a peculiarity of the meditations that they contain almost no personal details, no names of family members, no descriptions of intimate moments, no acknowledgments of the particular people who must have mattered most to the man who wrote them. This is partly a consequence of the work's purpose, for the meditations were not a memoir or a journal in the conventional sense, but a series of philosophical exercises, and the person to whom they were addressed was not a reader, but the writer himself, and the questions they explored were universal rather than particular. The nature of virtue, the transience of life, the discipline of the mind, questions that do not require the naming of names. But it is also a consequence of the conventions of Stoic writing, which tended to abstract the particular into the general, to transform the specific grief into a meditation on grief itself, and to treat the individual loss as an occasion for reflecting on the universal condition of loss that all human beings share. And yet Marcus was not a man without love, and the people he loved are visible in his writings, even when their names are not. Visible in the tenderness with which he writes about human connection, in the urgency with which he urges himself to value the people in his life while they are still present, and in the grief that surfaces, despite his best efforts at philosophical composure, whenever he allows himself to think about the people he has lost. His wife Faustina was a constant presence in his life, though the historical record of their marriage is complicated and not entirely flattering, for Faustina was accused, by sources that may or may not have been reliable, of various improprieties, and the marriage was, by most accounts, not without its difficulties. But Marcus never wrote a single word against her, not in the Meditations, and not in any surviving letter, and this silence, in the context of a man who wrote about everything, who examined every impulse, and analyzed every motive, and left nothing unexamined. This silence speaks volumes, suggesting a loyalty, or at least a discretion, that was rooted not in philosophy, but in something deeper, in the simple, human fact that he had loved her, or had chosen to love her, and that this choice was not contingent on her perfection. They had had many children together, and several of these children had died in infancy or childhood, as was common in the ancient world, where the mortality rate for the very young was appallingly high, and each of these deaths, Marcus wrote, had been a blow, not softened by its familiarity. For the death of a child is not something that a parent ever gets used to, no matter how many times it happens. And the Stoic arguments about the naturalness of death and the irrationality of excessive grief, which Marcus knew as well as anyone, provided comfort at the level of the intellect, but did not reach down into the place where the pain actually lived. The place where love had taken root and could not be pulled out without tearing something that could not be repaired. The oil lamp on his desk had burned low, the olive oil almost exhausted, and the flame now was barely more than a blue whisper at the tip of the wick, casting a light so faint that the shadows in the far corners of the tent had merged into a single, undifferentiated darkness. In that dimness, the wax tablets on the desk before him seemed to glow with a faint, pale luminescence of their own, as if the words he had written into them were somehow radiating back the light they had absorbed. And Marcus ran his thumb across the surface of one tablet, feeling the shallow grooves where the stylus had passed, the physical trace of his own thoughts, made tangible and touchable. This was the paradox of love, he thought, that it made a person more vulnerable and yet also more fully alive, for the same openness that allowed the pain to enter also allowed in the joy. And a life without love, however safe from grief, would be a life so diminished as to hardly qualify as living at all. He remembered, on nights like this one, the sound of his children's voices in the gardens of the imperial palace, the particular quality of a child's laughter when it echoes off marble walls, and the way their small hands felt in his when they walked together through the porticos. And these memories, which he did not record in the meditations, but which surely shaped the man who wrote them, were among the things that made his philosophy real, that gave it the weight of genuine feeling rather than the lightness of mere intellectual exercise. For a philosophy of acceptance that has never been tested by the fear of losing what one loves is a philosophy that has not yet been tested at all. And Marcus had been tested repeatedly and painfully, and the fact that he continued to write and to think and to try to live well despite the losses he had suffered was, in its own quiet way, the strongest argument for the philosophy that he practiced. He thought about the particular quality of grief for a child, which is different from any other kind of grief. For a child is not merely a person who has died, but a future that has been cancelled, a set of possibilities that will never be realized. And the parent who grieves a child is mourning not only what was, but what would have been. The first words, the first steps, the first day of school, the wedding, the children of their own that would never be born. Marcus did not write about this explicitly, for the meditations were not the place for such intimate grief, but it is there in the background of everything he writes about loss and acceptance, a shadow that gives depth and seriousness to the philosophy. For we trust a philosopher who has suffered more than we trust one who has not. And we trust Marcus because we know, even if the details are absent from the text, that the words were written not from the comfort of a library, but from the uncomfortable reality of a life in which everything that could be taken had, at one point or another, been taken. And then there were the teachers, the men who had shaped his mind and his character, and who had one by one passed away during the long years of his reign, leaving him to carry their teachings forward without their presence to guide and correct him. Rusticus, who had first introduced him to Epictetus, had died during one of the persecutions that periodically swept through the Roman world, and Marcus had mourned him not only as a teacher, but as a friend, a man whose patience and learning and quiet integrity had been a model of everything that Marcus aspired to be. Other teachers had followed, some dying of natural causes, some of the illness that had swept through the empire, and with each loss, Marcus had felt the world grow slightly smaller, as if the architecture of his own inner life were losing one of its supporting pillars. And he had written, with a melancholy that his philosophy could acknowledge, but not entirely dispel, that the best people are like the stars. They shine whether or not anyone is looking, and when they go out, the sky is darker, not metaphorically, but actually. The world is a lesser place for their absence. And his adoptive father Antoninus, who had been not only a mentor, but the closest thing to a true father that Marcus had ever known, for his biological father had died when Marcus was very young, and it was Antoninus who had raised him, who had prepared him for the responsibilities of empire, and who had, by all accounts, been a man of such steady, unremarkable goodness that his reign was remembered as a golden age. Not because anything extraordinary happened during it, but because nothing terrible did. Marcus had modeled his own approach to governance on Antoninus's example, trying to emulate that same steadiness, that same calm, that same refusal to be provoked into rash action by the crises and temptations that the office of emperor inevitably presented. And when Antoninus died, Marcus had felt the loss not as an emperor losing a predecessor, but as a son losing a father, and the grief had been sharp and private and lasting, and it had taught him, more than any philosophical text, that the love we feel for the people who have shaped us does not diminish with their passing, but continues to resonate within us, like the sound of a bell that has been struck and continues to vibrate long after the hammer has been withdrawn. There is a phrase that has become associated with Stoic philosophy, though it was not used by the Stoics themselves, and the phrase is amor fati, which means the love of fate, the embrace of everything that happens, not merely the pleasant things but the difficult ones, not merely the moments of joy, but the moments of sorrow and loss and uncertainty. It is an idea that sounds, at first, almost impossible, for who among us truly loves the things that cause us pain? Who welcomes the setbacks and the disappointments and the failures that are an inevitable part of any human life? And yet Marcus Aurelius came closer to this ideal than perhaps any other person in history, not because he was incapable of feeling pain or disappointment, but because he had trained himself over decades of deliberate practice to meet each event as it arrived with a kind of open-handed acceptance a willingness to receive whatever the universe chose to send. This did not mean that he was passive or that he made no effort to improve the circumstances in which he found himself. For the Stoic acceptance of fate is not the same as fatalism, and the distinction is important. A fatalist believes that nothing we do matters because the outcome is already determined, and so there is no point in trying. A Stoic believes that what matters is not the outcome, but the quality of the effort, and that the only thing truly within our control is the character with which we meet the events that befall us. Marcus fought the wars on the frontier because fighting them was his duty, and he tried to govern well because governing well was his function, and he did not abandon these efforts in the name of acceptance, for acceptance, in the Stoic sense, does not mean giving up, but rather giving over, releasing the attachment to a particular outcome, and focusing instead on the integrity of the process. He pressed the stylus into the wax and wrote that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. And these words, which would later be paraphrased and popularized by other writers, captured something essential about his approach to the difficulties of his life. For he had discovered, through long experience, that the obstacles he encountered were not, in fact, obstacles to his growth, but the very medium through which growth occurred. As a river does not flow despite the rocks in its bed, but because of them, the rocks shaping the current and giving it direction and force. And so, when the campaigns on the frontier dragged on year after year, with no resolution in sight, Marcus did not rail against the delay or despair of ever reaching a conclusion, but instead used the time as an opportunity for the work of self-examination that produced the Meditations. And when the great illness swept through the empire, killing millions, he did not conclude that the gods were cruel or that the universe was malevolent, but instead turned his attention to the question of how a wise person responds to catastrophe. And when the people he loved died, one after another, he allowed himself to grieve. But he did not allow the grief to become the defining feature of his character. And he returned again and again to the practice of gratitude, to the discipline of remembering what he still had rather than brooding over what he had lost. The cold of the tent had settled into his bones now, a familiar companion of these frontier nights, and he could feel the slow, rhythmic throb of his own pulse in his fingertips as they rested on the edge of the wax tablet. Outside, a distant horn sounded. The changing of the watch, a single low note that traveled across the frozen ground and was absorbed by the darkness. and in its fading Marcus heard something that might have been called the music of duty, the sound of a world that continued to function whether he was awake to observe it or not. And this was comforting, for it meant that the universe did not depend on his vigilance, that he could lay down his stylus and close his eyes, and the world would continue to turn. The centuries would continue their rounds. The stars would continue their slow rotation overhead, and sleep, when it came, would not be a dereliction of duty, but a small and necessary surrender to the rhythm that governs all living things. This was not easy. He was the first to acknowledge that it was not easy, that the discipline of acceptance was a daily practice and not a one-time achievement, and that there were days when the weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him with a force that made philosophy seem like a thin and inadequate shield against the realities of power and pain and mortality. On those days, and there were many of them, he did not pretend to feel calm when he did not feel calm, or to be serene when he was in fact deeply troubled, for the meditations are remarkable for their honesty, and Marcus does not portray himself as a sage who has achieved perfect tranquility, but as a man who is trying, with whatever limited strength he possesses, to move in the direction of tranquility, and who sometimes succeeds and sometimes fails, and who documents both outcomes with the same dispassionate precision. And this, perhaps, is the most valuable thing that the meditations have to offer. Not a promise that acceptance is easy, or that peace is achievable through a simple technique, or that the wise person is immune to suffering, but a demonstration, worked out over years and across hundreds of pages, that the effort itself is worthwhile, that the daily practice of examining one's thoughts and correcting one's course and opening one's hands to whatever comes, this effort, sustained through good days and bad days alike, produces a kind of inner stability that is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a deeper, steadier current beneath the surface turbulence, and that this stability, though it does not eliminate suffering, does prevent suffering from becoming the whole of one's experience, leaving room, even in the darkest moments, for gratitude and for wonder, and for the quiet recognition that to be alive at all, in any circumstance, is a remarkable and temporary thing. There is a practice within Stoic philosophy called the premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, and while the name sounds grim, the actual practice is anything but, for it consists simply of spending a few moments each day imagining the loss of the things one values, not to cultivate pessimism, but to cultivate appreciation, to remind oneself, while the things are still present, that they are temporary, and that the time to value them is now, not later, not when they are gone, but now, while they are here. Marcus had practiced this discipline for years, and on this particular night, sitting in the cold of the frontier, far from the people and the places he loved, the practice had become not an exercise, but a lived reality. For the things he had imagined losing were, in many cases, already lost. And the question was no longer how he would cope. If they were taken, but how he was coping now that they had been, and the answer, which he wrote into the wax with careful deliberation, was that he was coping the way a human being copes with any profound loss, imperfectly, painfully, and with the help of a philosophy that did not pretend to make the pain disappear, but did offer a framework for living through it with one's character intact. He set the tablet down and let his hands rest in his lap, and for a long moment he simply sat, breathing in the cold air and letting the warmth of the brazier reach him. And the thought that came to him, unbidden and gentle, was that this night, this particular night on the frozen frontier, with its cold and its silence and its slow, patient work of writing, was not something to be endured, but something to be received. A gift from a universe that asked nothing in return except that he be present for it. And he was present for it, fully and completely. And that, in the end, was all that acceptance meant. The final years of Marcus Aurelius's life were spent, as so many of his years had been spent, on the frontier, far from Rome, far from the comforts of the Palatine, far from the libraries and the gardens and the quiet rooms where he would have preferred to spend his days, reading and writing and thinking. He was old now, and tired, and sick in ways that the physicians could not fully explain or treat, and the cold of the northern winters, which had always been difficult for a man raised in the mild Mediterranean climate of Rome, had become almost unbearable, settling into his bones and his lungs, and making every breath an effort, and every morning a negotiation between the duties that called him and the body that protested against answering them. And yet he continued. He continued to govern, issuing edicts and hearing petitions, and making the thousands of small and large decisions that kept the empire functioning. And he continued to write, filling wax tablets with the same kind of careful self-examination that had filled his nights for 2 decades. And he continued to try, with whatever energy remained to him, to be the person that his philosophy told him a person should be, not out of a desire for glory or for a favorable judgment from history, but because the effort itself was the thing that mattered, and because to stop trying would have been, in the deepest sense, to stop living. He thought about death, often in these final years, not with fear, or not only with fear, for there was fear. He was honest enough to admit that a fear that surfaced in the small hours of the morning, when the body was at its weakest, and the mind was most vulnerable to its own anxieties. But alongside the fear, there was also a kind of curiosity, and a kind of readiness, and a growing sense that death was not an interruption of life, but its natural conclusion, as natural and as inevitable as the setting of the sun or the falling of an autumn leaf, and that the wise person meets this conclusion not with defiance and not with despair, but with a quiet acceptance that is not so different from the acceptance with which they have met everything else that life has brought. He wrote that to think of death as something terrible is to think of ourselves as something special, as if we were the first generation of human beings to confront this particular reality. And yet every generation that has ever lived has confronted it, and every individual who has ever drawn breath has, at some point, had to face the fact that their breath will not continue forever. And this confrontation, far from being a cause for anguish, is, for the Stoic, an occasion for clarity, for it strips away the illusions and the pretenses and the distractions that occupy so much of our attention, and reveals, with an almost brutal simplicity, what is actually important. He thought about the people who had died before him, and he did not think of them with the conventional grief of a mourner, but with something quieter and more reflective, a kind of gentle recognition that they had been passengers on the same river, traveling the same stretch of water, and that their journey had simply ended a little earlier than his. His brother Lucius Verus, his co-emperor, who had died years ago of the same illness that had swept through the empire. His teachers, one by one, their voices silenced, their wisdom preserved only in the memories of those who had listened. The soldiers who had died on this very frontier, whose names he would never know, whose graves were scattered across the cold ground beyond the palisade. All of them, he wrote, had returned to the nature from which they had come, and the nature that received them was the same nature that had produced them, and there was no cause for anger or grief in a process that was as natural and as necessary as the turning of the earth. What was actually important, Marcus had concluded after years of reflection, was surprisingly little. It was the quality of one's character. It was the effort to live justly and temperately and courageously. It was the practice of kindness toward the people one encountered, even the difficult ones, even the ones who seemed to deserve something other than kindness. It was the daily, hourly discipline of attending to one's own mind and correcting its errors and steering it gently but persistently toward the good. These things were within his power, and they would remain within his power until the very last moment of his life, and no disease, no military crisis, no political intrigue, no act of fate or fortune could take them from him unless he chose to surrender them. And this, he wrote, was the true meaning of inner freedom. Not the absence of external constraint, but the presence of an inner fortress that could not be breached by any force outside the self. And so, on the nights when the cold was deepest and the cough was worst and the weight of the empire pressed down on him with a force that made every other concern seem trivial by comparison, Marcus Aurelius sat at his desk by the light of his oil lamps and wrote to himself. And the words he wrote were not the words of a man who had conquered the world, but the words of a man who was trying, with whatever strength he had left, to conquer himself, and who understood that this was the only conquest that mattered, the only one that would endure beyond the fall of empires and the crumbling of monuments and the fading of every name that had ever been inscribed in stone. His hands ached with cold now, the joints stiff and unresponsive, and the stylus felt heavier than it once had, as if the bronze itself were absorbing the fatigue of the long night and reflecting it back through his fingers. The wax tablet before him was nearly filled, its surface covered with the close, angular script that he had perfected over years of practice. And he looked at it for a moment with something approaching tenderness. This small rectangle of beeswax and wood that held the shape of his inner life. The doubts and resolves and observations of a man who had spent his entire adulthood trying to become the person that his philosophy told him it was possible to be. The scent of the lamp oil, warm and faintly medicinal, mixed with the cold, clean smell of snow that had found its way under the tent flap. And in that mingling of warmth and cold, of effort and rest, of the day that was ending and the sleep that was finally gently approaching, there was a kind of wholeness that Marcus recognized as the closest thing to happiness that his philosophy had to offer. Not the absence of suffering, but the presence of a mind that had made its peace with the suffering that could not be avoided. The brazier had burned low again, and this time Marcus did not rise to replenish it, but sat instead in the slowly cooling air of the tent, watching the embers fade from amber to red to a deep, barely visible glow, and he felt in that fading warmth something that was not quite peace and not quite resignation, but a quality that lay somewhere between the two. a willingness to let the fire burn down, a trust that the cold that would follow was not an enemy, but simply the next thing, and that the night, which had been so long and so full of thought, was at last beginning to release its hold on him, loosening its grip as the first grey suggestion of dawn touched the eastern sky beyond the tent flap, and the stars, which had been so bright and so numerous when the night was young, had begun, one by one, to disappear. He thought about what would happen to the words he had written, and he smiled, very slightly, at the absurdity of the question, for he did not know and could not know, and in the deepest sense, did not care, for the writing had been its own purpose. The act of self-examination had been its own reward, and if the tablets were lost, or destroyed, or forgotten, the practice would still have been worthwhile, because it had been done not for posterity, but for himself, in the small hours of the morning, in a tent on the frozen frontier, with a stylus and a lamp, and the quiet determination of a man who understood that the only life he would ever truly possess was the one he was living at this very moment, and that the only moment that truly mattered was always this one, now and now and now. The night has deepened now. The camp is silent. The emperor sleeps at last. His stylus rests on the tablet beside him. The words he has written press into the wax, like seeds pressed into soil. They wait for a season he will not see, but they will, in time, produce a harvest beyond anything he imagined. The brazier has burned to embers. They glow softly in the darkness. A deep and patient warmth remains. It will last for hours yet. It will outlast the man who tended it. We have sat with him through this long night. We have followed the writing and the thinking and the quiet, relentless work of examining a life. We too can feel the pull of sleep now. It softens the edges of thought. It blurs the sharp outlines of worry. It draws us gently downward into rest. The sounds of the night have become distant, muffled, as if heard through thick walls. The last images that flicker behind closed eyelids are not of emperors or empires. They are simpler things. The glow of a fire, water moving over stones, the feel of a heavy blanket pulled close, the quality of silence in a place where many people sleep, a silence that is not empty but full of breathing and dreaming and the quiet rhythm of rest. These are the things that remain when philosophy has been set aside, when the writing is done. when the long effort of making sense of the world has been, for now, released. Think of the frontier as it must look just before dawn. The sky not yet light, but no longer fully dark. That deep blue, grey hour when even the stars begin to rest. The frost on the tents thinning. The horses quiet in their lines. The sentries walking their rounds in slow, measured steps. Their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The whole camp held in a stillness that is deeper than sleep, a stillness that belongs to the world itself, the world before people, the world as it was and will be again. This is the kind of stillness that Marcus Aurelius sought. Not the absence of thought, but the presence of a deeper quiet beneath the thought. The way a river continues to flow beneath a layer of ice, unseen but not stopped. His philosophy was never about silencing the mind. It was about finding, within the noise and the worry, and the endless machinery of obligation, a center that held, a point of stillness that did not depend on circumstances, that could not be taken by force or stolen by time. Perhaps this is what Marcus Aurelius would have wanted. Not that we remember his words with precision, not that we recite his maxims as if they were spells, but that we take from his example the simple practice of letting go, of releasing our grip on what we cannot control, of trusting that the night is deep enough to hold whatever we carry into it. The stars continue their slow turn above the frontier. The Danube continues its quiet flow beneath the ice. The camp breathes in its sleep. 10,000 people resting in the cold. The emperor among them. The philosophy among them. The words in wax that will outlast them all. The tent is warm. The embers glow. The stylus is still. Everything that needed to be written has been written. Everything that needed to be released has been released. The night is doing its work now, and the work is gentle, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight settle. Let the night do its work.